Good day, and welcome to the Estimand Academy of Clinical Trials. Today, we'd like to bring Estimands alive to you through real case studies. And we will start today with our first webinar, where we will pioneer Estimands in clinical development. Next slide, please. We are here from the Estimand Implementation Working Group. This is an initiative from the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations and the European Federation of Statisticians in the Pharmaceutical Industry. This group brings together statisticians and clinicians to support the estimate journey. Next slide, please. The working group consists of representatives from 21 industry partners and the regulatory authority MHRA in the UK. And as you can see, there are clinicians and statisticians together working in this very active working group. Next slide, please. As a disclaimer, the opinions are those of the presenters and are not necessarily of the representing companies in this webinar. My name is Nanco Hefting. I'm a chief specialist at the Clinical Research Psychiatry department at Lynggaard, and I'm a co-chair of the Estimand Implementation Working Group. With us today, we have Sue McKendrick, who is the Associate Statistical Science Director, leading the cross-functional estimate working group at PPD, and she will be co-presenting on our case today. Together with Melanie Wright, the Biostatistics Global Group Head, who has led the development and rollout of a cross-functional training in estimates at Novartis. To discuss our case study today, we have from NovoNordisk Rikke Agesen, Senior International Medical Manager at NovoNordisk, who will bring the physician's perspective on estimates in the working group. Also here is Helle Lynggaard, Principal Statistician and key driver in implementing estimates in NovoNordisk. She has provided support to the clinical trial team working on Pioneer 1, our case study today. Next slide, please. Our thanks and acknowledgement goes out to NovoNordisk for their pioneering work and allowing us to use the case study. Also to FPA and FSPI as the sponsors and promoting this webinar. To the working group members for a real lively discussion and comments on the slides, and to Sue with her super analogy. I should also mention that this webinar will be recorded and that the recording will be made available in a short while on the PSI website, where you can find it back. Also, if you have questions, you can use the chat on your right side of the screen. You will all be muted during the presentations, but we will collect the questions and we will try to bring them up in the question and answer session at the end of this webinar. So, Melanie, over to you to kick our first webinar off with a case study.
Thanks very much, Nanco, for that kind introduction. So just to take you through the agenda today, so I'll describe to you the learning outcomes from this short webinar training, and then Sue McKendrick will introduce to you the Estimand framework. Then Sue and I will introduce the case study to you today, the Pioneer 1 study, which is a NovoNordisk diabetes study. We'll also describe the intercurrent events, the background information, and then take you through the story of that study. And then there will be a short discussion involving Helle and Rikke from NovoNordisk about the study. And then Sue will take you through and have some discussion about consideration of stakeholders, and they may be interested in different questions in different estimands. And there will be another short discussion involving Helle and Rikke. And then Sue and I will wrap up, and then we'll hope that we have plenty of time at the end to answer some of your questions. So the learning outcomes for today, we would hope that at the end of this short webinar, you would be able to discuss with others the definition of the Estimand using simple language, and to be able to identify intercurrent events in your trials, to recognise the benefits of following the Estimand framework in the context of the clinical trial, in particular to gain alignment on the questions of interest, to think about how it can help you frame questions that may be of interest to different stakeholders and from different points of view, and also importantly to think about the benefit in terms of transparency of the aims of your clinical trial and in the protocol, and then also transparency in the communication of trial results at the end of the trial. So with that, I would like to pass to Sue, and she will take you through the introduction to the framework. Thanks, Sue. You're muted, Sue.
Thank you for that. Okay, so the Estimand framework's a very logical sequence of events, and it was introduced in the ICH E9 addendum on Estimands and sensitivity analyses. And although this is an addendum to a statistical guidance, E9, it is far-reaching, and it should concern, you know, the whole team. It's not really just something that is a concern for statisticians. So I hope we have many people on the call that aren't, you know, from the whole team and not just the statistical side. So the other thing to mention as well with Estimands is I think we're going to start to see these creeping into other guidances, you know, therapeutic guidances. So watch out for that. So anyway, we start with clear trial objectives, and Estimands are just an extension of those objectives with additional details thought through. So it's really a precise description of what we want to find out, you know, requiring the input of the whole team. And those objectives and Estimands, they drive the study design and the study conduct, as well as the choice of the stats methods. So that it's the choice of the Estimand, not the stats methods, which is going to be the focus of this webinar. You know, and once, of course, the study's been conducted, and you know we've got the data and we've analysed it. You know, at the end of the day, we have our actual estimate, the numerical result. So when it comes to what we want to find out, it's a bit like writing a recipe for soup. So we'll move on to the next slide and I'll explain what I mean. So, you know, at the weekend, you know, I quite often use up my leftover vegetables, throw it all in a pot and make some soup. You know, I've done this for over many years now, and I've got plenty of experience. I don't feel I need particularly a recipe book, but I think, I'm not sure if my husband would completely agree, you know, on the rare occasion that he likes it, I can never remember what I did. So in contrast to that, our favourite restaurant, so if you click again, Mel, you know, their French onion soup, for example, they'll follow a precise recipe. It's reproducible every time we go back. You know, it's going to be good. It's going to taste the same as what we remembered from before. They'll only include the recipe ingredients, and you know, in terms of how that. Sorry, my husband, who's actually allergic to gluten, I'll just mention that quickly. You know, for him, the transparency in the ingredients is really important for him to know that it's safe for him to eat. So what has this analogy got to do with Estimands? Well, the Estimand gives the precise description of what we intend to find out in the study, and there is transparency in those ingredients, which helps the regulators, the prescribers, the payers, the patients with their decision making. And it's clear which data will be needed. Some data will be relevant for one Estimand, but not for another, and we're going to come back to that later. So if you click again, Mel, if it's good practice, you know, is it good practice, or are we overcomplicating it. I mean, certainly when it comes to the food, there's been, in Europe at least, there's been increased legislation around food labelling. I think it's created a bit more sort of upfront work, but it's been immensely helpful to people with allergies and being able to identify what is safe to eat. And similarly, discussions and documentation of Estimands, it will take a bit more time up front, but it should lead to better focus and transparency in our clinical research, leading to more informed decision making. So on the next slide, let's take a look at the ingredients of the Estimand. So we have the population level measure, the endpoint, which is what we measure on the individual, the population, the target population that we're measuring in, the treatment conditions we wish to compare, and the strategies for intercurrent events. So we'll explain intercurrent events a little bit more later, but briefly, these are events that occur after treatment initiation that impact our outcome or stop us from measuring it. So in the next slide again, please. So just want to sort of make sure everyone's clear on all these different words that all begin with EST. The Estimand is the what we want to find out, you know, the what type of soup, or the precise description of what we want to find out in our study. Whereas the how we cook the soup is aligned to the estimator or estimation methods. So that includes, you know, the definitions of analysis sets and censoring rules, missing data handling approaches, as well as choice of statistical model. And ultimately, we get our estimate at the end, numerical result with the resulting soup. So if you like, our recipe book is the protocol. So who decides, you know, what type of soup? Well, it's a team effort, which involves the clinical scientists, the physicians, as well as statisticians, you know, all the people that would normally be involved in protocol development, you know, and talking through the concept of the protocol and the objectives of that protocol. You know, Estimands needs to be another thing on the table during those discussions. And being transparent and discussing Estimands in your protocol, I think, we hope it will be very valuable, and you'll get some really good engagement with regulators, and that should lead to smoother drug approvals and hopefully less problems, you know, post hoc analyses and things like that later that can take time later in the process. Anyway, over to you, Mel.
Thanks very much, Sue. So let's just introduce to you the Pioneer 1 trial. So just as a very sort of quick overview so that you get a context of the trial and the overview of what the study team discussed. So this was a phase 3A clinical trial. And this is an interesting case because, in fact, the clinical team started discussing Estimand concepts in 2015, 2016, and actually had discussions with regulators at that time. There was at that time already some discussion around the Estimand thinking, but it wasn't until 2017 when the draft ACHE9 addendum was actually released. With the Estimand concepts as we know it today. The team then also, as well as having those discussions with regulators about Estimands and defining Estimands actually in the trial protocol, they followed this all the way through, and even in the press release that was that came out in 2018, they described their headline results from the trial together also with Estimands in the press release. Finally, also in the primary manuscript, as well as in a Wiley Review article, they also were very, very transparent about the results and the Estimands that were assessed at that time. In 2020, 2019-20, oral semaglutide was finally approved in US and Europe, and we'll talk more about the results later and take you through that. But now I'll pass back to Sue, and Sue is going to give you the background to the Pioneer 1 trial.
Okay, thank you, Mel. So this was a phase 3A study by NovoNordisk, which randomized 703 patients globally. And in terms of the investigational medicinal product, or IMP, as we abbreviate it to, they were looking at 3 different doses, 3, 7, 14 mg of oral semaglutide compared to placebo. And semaglutide is, for those that understand these things, it's a new GLP-1 analog, and it's taken once daily as a tablet. So the primary objective was to compare the effects of treatment on glycemic control in patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus as an adjunct to diet and exercise. And the primary endpoint was the week 26 change from baseline in the glycated hemoglobin A1C, which is abbreviated as HbA1c. So this is a measure where low values below, say, 7% indicate good glycemic control, whereas higher values are not so good. Now, it is a placebo-controlled study, and therefore rescue medication is something that was included in the study, obviously for ethical reasons. It was essential to offer participants the chance to receive rescue medication during the trial if they do not reach the targets for glycemic control. So that was given as an addition on top of the study medication. So let's move on and think about the patient journeys. And this is something that I think is really valuable to sort of think about, in any context, any clinical study, particularly, what happens in clinical practice if there's a lack of efficacy, or there are tolerability issues with a treatment. What are the different things that might happen that could impact the outcomes we measure? Some of the things that may be, can be a bit problematic in a study to actually think them through up front. So in this case, patient 2 here discontinues her medication before reaching week 26, and we've depicted that with a little blue icon. And patient 3 may have poor glycemic control and requires an additional rescue medication given on top of the IMP, and that's been depicted by this little red life belt symbol. So there are examples. These are examples of intercurrent events that impact the measure of glycemic control. Let's look at the next slide to just sort of think about that in a bit more detail. So first of all, the red kind of dotted line here, which might be around 7%, is the threshold between good and bad glycemic control. So values above would be considered a lack of efficacy and trigger the need for rescue medication. So in the left-hand plot, the profile there for the subject, you can see HbA1c is going up. It's crossing that boundary. There's a lack of efficacy, so they take rescue medication. Then after visit 5, you can see there's a clear impact of having taken that rescue medication with HbA1c declining. Whereas in the right-hand plot, here we've got a subject who looks like they're doing quite well, and actually HbA1c is well under control all the way through to visit 5, but then something happens and they discontinue treatment, and from that point on there's a worsening in HbA1c. So you can see there's, in each case, these intercurrent events of rescue med and discontinuation of treatment are having an impact on the outcome measure. Okay, just a side note that, you know, in the actual Pioneer 1 study, the rules about rescue medication were a little more complicated than this. They looked at levels of fasting blood glucose, and also, if you like, the goalposts changed over time, so the threshold tightened over time. So, but hopefully this gives you the feel for, you know, this just general idea that intercurrent events are things that have an impact on the outcome that we measure. So in the next slide, you'll see a further idea, which is that, you know, quite often there's an imbalance in the level of intercurrent events, and that causes us issues in our interpretation. So here, you know, more patients would be expected to require rescue medication in the placebo arm, whilst we might see slightly more people in the active arm that need to discontinue treatment. So we need some careful planning and handling for the intercurrent events, so that we don't have difficulties in our interpretation. The next slide, just to sort of sum up some of these key points. So there's a diversity in the patient journeys, and it can fundamentally, you know, raise fundamental questions regarding how we evaluate treatment effects. The addendum introduced this concept of Estimand, you know, to try to ensure that we precisely describe the treatment effect of interest. And this kind of framework, Estimand framework, helps us to structure our discussions and, you know, to think about the relationship between the patient journeys, the treatment effect of interest, and to consider our strategies for intercurrent events. So let's just take a quick look at what the ICH addendum says about possible strategies for intercurrent events before we apply these to the case study, the Pioneer 1 case study. So firstly, to emphasize, the addendum is about detailing all the attributes of the Estimand, but the part that's most unfamiliar, I think, is considering these strategies for handling intercurrent events. And there are 5 strategies that are mentioned, but there may be more. So firstly, treatment policy is where we're trying to understand the effects regardless of an intercurrent event. So regardless of non-adherence, for example, and this requires that we follow people up after the intercurrent event. Hypothetical is where we consider a scenario, so in which the intercurrent event would not occur, so as though rescue medication does not exist, for example. While on treatment, here we might be interested in a rate of change or an event rate while treatment is taken as directed. That is kind of assuming that treatment discontinuation is the intercurrent event we're thinking about there. If you were thinking about death in quality of life outcomes, you might be thinking of while alive as a sort of slight adaptation of that strategy. So composite, this is where we incorporate the intercurrent event in some way into our variable or endpoint. It could be as simple as a success failure endpoint, and, you know, death would be considered a failure, or treatment discontinuation due to tolerability would be considered a failure, or it could be that we've got a more complex type of composite endpoint. It doesn't necessarily need to be binary. Principal stratum. So this is where we're looking at a population of interest, which is kind of defined by those in whom the intercurrent event would or would not occur. So one of the examples of this might be to look at the benefit of our treatment in those patients who can tolerate this class of drug. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of the intercurrent events, and I'll hand back to Mel now.
Thanks, Sue. So if we go back to the Pioneer 1 trial and think about and I'll describe to you the Estimands then that the team considered. So if we think about the primary objective again, they specified their primary objective to compare the effects of 3 dose levels of once daily oral semaglutide versus placebo on glycemic, and to assess glycemic control in subjects with type 2 diabetes mellitus treated with diet and exercise only. This was one primary objective, but actually the team specified 2 Estimands, and I'll take you through their definition in a minute. Just for a little bit of fun, and because Sue used the soup analogy earlier, we're going to call Estimand 1 our confounded or reality recipe. This was a recipe where the team considered the HbA1c irrespective of intercurrent events, and we have Estimand 2, which we're calling our pure or if only recipe. So it's as though those intercurrent events didn't occur. And for the sake of simplicity, we'll really just describe the Estimands and then the results for the 14 milligram dose versus placebo. So if we go through, first of all, Estimand 1, what we have done here is we've actually written out the Estimand, but in terms of a clinical question, but you'll see that all of the attributes of the Estimand are included in the question. So we can consider Estimand 1 as being what is the difference between means, which is our population level summary measure, in change from baseline HbA1c after 26 weeks, the endpoint, in patients with type 2 diabetes, the population, treated with oral semaglutide 14 milligrams versus placebo, and this is irrespective of adherence to IMP and with use of rescue medication as required. And this can be considered the treatment conditions that are being compared. And here, where are our intercurrent events? In fact, the intercurrent events here are described as part of the treatment condition, and that our strategy for the intercurrent event is the treatment policy strategy in this case. And this alludes to the fact that, in fact, here, this first Estimand will be comparing oral semaglutide with use of rescue medication as required and irrespective of adherence to IMP versus placebo, irrespective of adherence to IMP or use of rescue medication. So let's have a look and see, well, what does this mean when we think about the patient journey? So in this particular case, it's clear that the HbA1c data at week 26, it will be impacted in some way by the fact that some patients discontinue IMP earlier, and some patients will have received rescue medication. But actually, all of the data is very relevant to answer this particular scientific question. And therefore, it's very important to be aware of that point and ensure that you have patient retention and follow-up in your trial. You really need to collect all your HbA1c data right to the end of the trial. If you don't, then you have to then consider issues with missing data, and that can become quite complex. And if we think about according to the, what does this mean according to the addendum? As Sue described, this means that the rescue medication as an intercurrent event has been reflected according to the treatment policy strategy, and the same for treatment discontinuation as well in this particular case. And why did we call this Estimand 1 the confounded or the reality Estimand? This sort of relates to different points of view. One person may say, well, actually, this is then, we're assessing here a treatment effect, which is actually being confounded by the fact that some patient may discontinue medication early, some patients may take rescue medication. Whereas another person may say, well, actually, this is fine. This Estimand addresses the reality. I want to know, well, what's the effect of oral semaglutide with patients as part of a regimen with patients taking rescue medication as required or as needed. So if we go to Estimands 2, so in this particular case, Estimands 2 can be described as a question again, as in what is the difference between means in change from baseline HbA1c after 26 weeks in patients with type 2 diabetes, treated with oral semaglutide 14 milligrams versus placebo. And in this case, it's as though patients always adhered to IMP and as though rescue medication was unavailable. And this is a different strategy for intercurrent events. And this forms almost like a scenario in this particular case. So let's look at that in a bit more detail. So if you think about the scenario as though rescue medication were unavailable, so what does this actually mean and how can this actually be achieved? If we go back to thinking about HbA1c for this particular patient who then required rescue medication at visit 5, we can think about, well, what if they hadn't had the rescue medication? And we want to address that particular scenario. So we need to think about how we can predict or impute the data as though the patient did not require or did not take, rescue medication. So this clearly then, this has to be addressed and thought very carefully about in the specification of the statistical methodology to make sure that that it's been carefully thought through what the assumptions are for this. And also there has to be some acknowledgement that there's going to be some uncertainty, of course, in the response in this case, which is reflected in the purple triangle on the graphic. So then we can think about exactly the same thing for discontinuation of IMP. Again, in this particular case, of course, HbA1c would be impacted by the or we would expect it to be impacted by the discontinuation of IMP. So again, it needs to consider use of prediction or imputation to assess what would have been the HbA1c had IMP been continued. So if we think about what does this mean in terms of the patient journeys in this particular case and the data that would actually be used? So in this particular example, to answer this question, to assess this estimand, we would actually only use the HbA1c data collected until the intercurrent event occurred, so until discontinuation of IMP or rescue medication. So only those data will actually be useful for the analysis. And if we then think about the terminology according to the addendum, the terminology that they have used is that rescue medication in this case would be reflected according to the hypothetical strategy, and treatment discontinuation or discontinuation of IMP would be reflected according to the hypothetical strategy. One thing to note is that in both Estimands 1 and Estimands 2 here, the team decided to use the same strategy for both intercurrent events, but that doesn't have to be the case. You can use a different strategy for a different intercurrent event, and we'll show you an example later. So why did we call the Estimands 2 the pure or the if-only recipe? I mean, again, similar to Estimands 1, it really depends on your perspective. You may say, oh, well, this actually addresses the question of what is my pure treatment effect, as though patients didn't take rescue or didn't discontinue treatment. Or you may say, oh, I'm imagining a sort of like an if-only scenario. If it was possible to run the study in a certain way, I would be interested in that particular scenario. What you have to be very careful here is that the scenario that you're envisaging has to be useful for the decision that you want to make at the end and how you're going to use the results later on. So having now described the Estimands, I'm just going to take you through the study results from the Pioneer 1 trial. So if we consider first of all the frequency of the intercurrent events in the two different treatment groups, so we had here roughly 175 patients per arm who were randomized to each group. So if we look first of all at discontinuation of IMP, there were a few more patients who discontinued in the 40 milligram group than in the placebo group, but it was fairly similar across the groups. Whereas if you consider rescue medication, and this here is defined as a rescue medication which could have been initiated either before or after discontinuation of IMP. In this particular case, many more patients in the placebo group took rescue medication than they did in the 14 milligram group. So then if we think about the results, and in both cases for both of the Estimands, we have the same primary endpoint, which is change from baseline HbA1c at week 26. So then we have the results related to Estimand 1. So in this particular case, the mean change from baseline was minus 1.4% for 40 milligrams and minus 0.3% for placebo, resulting in a difference between means, which is our estimate of the treatment effect of minus 1.1. And if, just to remind you, so in this particular case, this is then comparing 40 milligrams with rescue medication as required and irrespective of discontinuation of IMP versus placebo, again with rescue medication as required. And then now you also have the knowledge that actually many more patients took rescue and placebo. It gives you a sense of what that mean change from baseline for placebo really means. If you didn't have that knowledge about rescue medication, you may even think, oh, there's a slight placebo effect in that result. So let's have a look at Estimand 2. So in Estimand 2, the mean change from baseline for 40 milligrams was minus 1.5%, and for placebo it was minus 0.1. And then the difference between those means was minus 1.4%. So a different result, and of course it's different because actually the question is completely different, and you're addressing really a different treatment effect here. So let's just to sort of summarize really the two Estimands as questions. So you can see that the question starts exactly the same way in both cases. Estimand 1 was irrespective of adherence to IMP and use of rescue medication as required, whereas Estimand 2 was envisaging a scenario as though patients always adhere to IMP and as though rescue medication is unavailable. And clearly the two estimates then are different, which is absolutely expected because these are different questions. So in this is giving us a nice example that the endpoint is the same here. They have the same primary endpoint, but we have two different questions, two different Estimands are being assessed. We have two different answers, and it's helping us sort of move away a little bit from this concept of one primary endpoint, one result, thinking more about the primary Estimand rather. So I would like to invite Helle and Rikke to put their cameras on, and then we'll have a short discussion about the Pioneer 1 trial. Great. So first of all, I'd like to ask, I'm interested, Helle, in why did the Pioneer team consider at the time writing Estimands into the protocol? I mean, this was well before the ICH E9 addendum was released.
Well, first of all, I would like to, on behalf of Rikke and myself, to thank you and the rest of the training team for inviting us to be part of this discussion panel and giving us the opportunity to discuss the Pioneer estimate. So thank you very much for that. Well, there was a series of events that took place that made us decide to include estimates in our protocol. First of all, in 2010, the National Research Council published the FDA Commission report, The Prevention and Treatment of Missing Data in Clinical Trials. And in that report, the use of last observation carry forward as a way to handle missing data in clinical trials was strongly discouraged, you could say. So why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because until that point in time, we had actually been taking this approach in our diabetes trials. So after this report came out, we began to receive feedback from FDA that they no longer would accept last observation carry forward. And at the same time, we also learned that what FDA really wanted us to do was to do what you can say is perhaps a more full-blown intention to treat analysis, in the sense that you do a full up of all your randomized patients, collect all the pre-planned data, and include all data in the statistical analysis. So this was very much different from what we have been doing in the past. So for instance, if a patient discontinued treatment in the past, at the same time, this patient would also be withdrawn from the trial. So this was something completely new, and it triggered some internal reflections and discussions on what is the impact of this? What does this really mean? And instead of discussing different statistical methodologies, we actually began to discuss the interpretation of it and what is the underlying clinical question. So what also happened was that in 2014, the ICH steering committee endorsed the concept paper for the E9 addendum. So we were there facing the planning of a new phase 3A program. So with all of this happening, to us at least, it was quite straightforward to consider having estimates in our protocols, also because this was something completely different from what we've been used to do in the past. So it was important for us also to be transparent about this, that this was something different. And again, you can ask why two. You presented two estimates. So the short answer is that, well, if you include two, you will have more information on your treatment effect compared to only having one. But from the interactions with FDA, it was very clear that they were basically only interested in estimate one, the confounded or reality estimate. And the European Medicines Agency, they were also interested in that one, but they also expressed an interest in the second estimate, estimate 2, the pure if only estimate. And the internal discussions we had, in those discussions, most stakeholders, they also expressed this about that to them. Estimate 2 reflected a more clinically relevant question. And finally, when we estimate estimate 2, that would give us some estimates that would be easier to compare with both our own old results, but also results from comparator products. So that was basically the background for having it in the protocol.
Great, thanks, Helle. And just to touch on, so did the choice and specification of Estimands in the protocol, did this affect in any way the study conduct?
Very much indeed, I must say. And by having estimate 1 in our protocols, as you also mentioned, we had to do a full follow-up on all our randomized patients. And we must do whatever we can to ensure that we have data from all patients. And we had the trial operations team to do a very important job trying to make plans for how to ensure that. So of course, we wanted data from all our randomized patients, but we also were a bit realistic, you could say, because if, for instance, a patient discontinued treatment early on in the trial, it may be a bit difficult to motivate such a patient to stay in the trial for the full duration, at least to make them attend all visits and to get all assessments done. So therefore, they also made a plan B. They asked the project team to prioritize the visits and assessments. And then they, if the patient was not willing to come in for all visits and assessments, then they would at least try to get a hold of the most important data. So we could estimate estimate 1 in a reliable way. And all the hard efforts paid off because we had across the Pioneer program, phase 3A trials, where Pioneer is one of them, we had a retention rate of approximately 95%. And that should be compared to a retention rate of 80% in previous trials with a similar drug and populations. Mm-hmm. So very impressive. So yeah, please remember, this is a very important aspect if you have an estimate with treatment policy strategy.
Thanks, Helle. Thanks. So Rikke, I would like to go to you. So from your perspective as a clinician, what is your ideas and what do clinicians want to know?
Thank you for a great question, Melanie. Clinicians really want to know the pure or if only effect of the drug. What can the drug do, in fact, do for our patients without confounding factors? This might make us dreamers or optimists, but knowing the pure effect of a drug can in many cases ease the conversation with us. But we are, of course, also realists as physicians or clinicians, with our feet very solid planted on the ground, and we do in fact acknowledge that every single patient journey is unique, be that in a clinical trial or in the real world setting. And events called intercurrent within the Estimands framework or just live in the real world setting, they will occur. Some patients will experience intolerability, some will need dose reduction, some will need rescue medications, and some will discontinue their drug. So this is also why I find that the estimates implemented in Pioneer 1 and throughout the Pioneer phase 3A program, they actually complement each other very nicely. Both are needed to address the primary objectives that we defined in the Pioneer 1, but they address it in two different ways. So as Helle also said, two are sometimes better than one.
Mm-hmm. Super. Thanks so much for those insights. Thank you very much. We'll ask you to come back later for another short discussion. So let's move on, and Sue is now going to take us through the consideration of different stakeholders and their interests in different questions. Over to you, Sue.
Okay, thanks very much, Mel. So, effectively there are many different stakeholders when we think about clinical studies. Most importantly is the patient. But obviously if you're a sponsor company, you might be very concerned about what the regulators are going to think and what their view might be. There's also, the prescribers and the payers of the drug, and who might have a different view again. So we want to frame questions, and really we want to consider all of their points of view, and we might want, a number of different estimands so that we can answer their questions from different perspectives. And we don't want to end up with lots of post hoc analyses much later on when we realise that we haven't answered the question that the payer has in mind, for example. And when you think about the Estimand having its 5 attributes, even if there are only 2 choices on each of those attributes, quite quickly you've got 32 different Estimands. So so there are a lot of potential possibilities for what the questions could be. And we need to sort of think them through, think what are the interesting ones, and then of course we then need to decide which should be primary. But let's move on to the next slide and think a bit more about the issue of how we handle treatment discontinuation. Thinking of it from different points of view. Well, if you're a sponsor company working on proof of concept, or a company looking at equivalence of a generic or a biosimilar, then you might well be interested in this if only pure Estimand, this hypothetical scenario, if only patients did not discontinue treatment. But from a phase 3 perspective, from the regulatory point of view, I think they are particularly concerned about when somebody discontinues treatment due to a tolerability issue. Now, is it reasonable to ask the question, as though somebody continued with a treatment, which they, quite frankly, they couldn't continue with it because they couldn't tolerate it? So in the actual addendum, there is a point made that the clinical and regulatory interest of such hypotheticals is limited. So it very much depends on what we're looking at. Now, there are other reasons for discontinuing treatment. Logistical issues, for example, that we've experienced this last year with pandemic lockdowns. So in that kind of case, asking a hypothetical question, what if treatment, we'd managed to continue a treatment, or what if treatment hadn't been interrupted? Those are very reasonable questions to ask in that kind of situation, but just take some special care to think about discontinuation of treatment for reasons related to the treatment, and separate that out from reasons that are unrelated to the treatment. Okay, so the other thing to mention with in terms of diabetes in particular, the EMA issued a draft guidance back in 2018 that Melanie mentioned, and it does mention Estimands. And if we move to the next slide, this shows our interpretation of the Estimand we think they're proposing there, and it's a mix of strategies. It's partway between Estimand 1 and Estimand 2. We've still got the as though rescue medication is unavailable element, the pure element from Estimand 2, but we've got the irrespective of adherence to IMP, using the treatment policy strategy there, a bit like our Estimand 1 reality Estimand. Okay, so it's a mix of the two, so we call this our fusion recipe. And if we go on and look at the patient journeys, in terms of what data would be relevant here, we would be using the data up until rescue medication is taken. Now, if we do have someone discontinuing treatment, if we are able to continue measuring them, we'd be able to use that data up until the point they need the rescue medication. So at the bottom there, you can just see a summary there. We're using a hypothetical strategy for rescue med and treatment policy strategy for treatment discontinuation. So, there are differences of opinion and lots of things on the table. Let's kind of invite Helle and Rikke back to a little bit of a discussion around different points of view. So thanks for coming back again, and maybe Rikke, I'd like to ask you first, from a physician's point of view, what you feel are the benefits of formulating clinical questions in terms of Estimands.
First of all, I would like again to emphasize that working within the Estimand framework is a cross-functional task. And that's actually also the greatest benefit when working within this framework. The clinical question of interest is the key, or the backbone of the sequence of events that you have so nicely described, is embedded in the framework. And the Estimand drives the trial design, it drives the statistical method, and even trial conduct, actually, where trial operations, as Helle has also previously spoken to, they are key players regarding retention, which is essential when addressing intercurrent events such as discontinuation with the treatment policy strategy. So the framework, it gives us transparency, and it eases the understanding of the estimate. And the estimate is exactly the answer to our clinical question of interest.
And I thank you. So it does definitely help us to come together, I think, clinicians and statisticians, and think a bit more deeply about what we are actually trying to find out and what it is we're going to be, how to interpret. So Helle, I just wonder, from your point of view, have you got any thoughts on other Estimands besides Estimand 1 and 2 and the Fusion Estimand that you think might be of interest here, you know, for example, from a patient perspective?
Well, if I was a patient and my physician offered me to initiate treatment with a GLP-1 analog, which has the class effect of having some gastrointestinal adverse events, especially in the beginning, and for some patients they are intolerable, so they have to discontinue treatment, then for sure I would like to know what is the risk I cannot tolerate this product. But if I can tolerate this product, if I am so fortunate I can tolerate it, which treatment effect can I expect to obtain if I initiate treatment with this one?
Mm-hmm.
And that would of course require a different type of study compared to Pioneer 1 to answer that question.
So this relates back to the principal stratum, looking at a principal stratum of those who can tolerate the drug.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Are there any other additional questions, Estimands, you know, if you could go back in time that you think you might add or might have added?
Well, now you just presented the Fusion Estimand, and of course it would be a natural step to consider including that estimand. But if we are in a standard diabetes trial, and most of our trials are not monotherapy trial like a Pioneer 1. So in most diabetes trials, if a patient discontinue the anti-diabetic medication, they would be in need of initiating a new anti-diabetic medication almost immediately or at the same time. So it would be more a switch. So you would not have a gap in between discontinuing one treatment and initiating another one. And because of that, the initiation of rescue medication, you could say, or a hypothetical strategy would kind of overrule or take over from the discontinuation of treatment and the treatment policy. So the result you will get from estimating such an estimate, the EMA estimate, would in many cases be very similar and in few occasions also perhaps identical to what you would get from estimating Estimand 2. So I don't think it would provide a lot of new information to us if we had considered that one. It wasn't available at the time when we planned the trials, but even so, I don't expect it to be very different. Perhaps for Pioneer 1, but not for the rest of the trials in the Pioneer program.
So there could be practicalities in being able to measure after discontinuing treatment and prior to rescue med being given. Yeah, okay. And I guess there are other statistical modelling things that perhaps we don't want to go into just now about using the reference information to help us do the predicting more as if you're on placebo after that point. But yes, okay. I think at this point perhaps we'll move on in our agenda. But thank you so much for that, and I know we're going to have some Q&As a bit later too from our audience.
Thanks, Sue. So now we'll just recap on some conclusions and learning outcomes, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So the conclusions from Pioneer 1, so you've heard that this is a trial which really pioneered Estimand thinking. The team thought about Estimands before even the ICH-E9 draft addendum was released. They specified 2 Estimands in the protocol. Both were defined with the same endpoint. 2 Estimands, they had 2 completely different answers. And this is a really nice case, and it's worth looking at the manuscript. They presented the results very clearly in the press release and then also in the primary manuscript for both Estimands, and we're very clear about that. Oral semaglutide was then approved based on the Pioneer program in 2019-2020 for EMA. And interestingly, the estimate, so i.e. the results of Estimand 1, which was our confounded reality recipe Estimand were actually presented in the labeling for both US and Europe. So just as a sort of wrap up, the Estimand, we can, Sue introduced the soup analogy. You can think about the Estimand, what type of soup do you want to eat this evening? We have our recipe ingredients, which are the different attributes of the Estimand, the intercurrent event strategies for intercurrent events, population level summary measure, endpoint, target population, treatment conditions. And this is a cross-functional activity. We need everyone to decide what soup are they eating tonight and what are the recipe ingredients. Clinical scientists, statisticians, physicians, regulatory affairs colleagues, the whole team need to get together and have that discussion, and then have the discussion as well with the regulators. Then our estimator is our statistical methods. This is how we want to cook our soup. And then finally, we have the estimate of the treatment effect, the numerical result, and the resulting soup, if you like, the tasty soup at that you have for your dinner. And all of this, the recipe would be defined in your protocol, the Estimand, of course, as well as the estimator, the statistical methods. So the Estimand is a powerful tool. This can help you frame questions of interest of interest to different stakeholders. This can include physicians, patients, regulators, payers. We can consider many different stakeholders. And here it's showing that it's not really all about the endpoint, but it's about the question precisely. What do we want to find out from our trial? Very importantly, if you consider all of this, then you've also then written down your recipe in the protocol. So just to pass over to Sue for the final recap.
Well, just a quick reminder really of the learning outcomes that Mel presented at the beginning. I mean, one of the key things is that we've got these new words, new language of intercurrent events and Estimands, but that language helps us, hopefully, once we understand it, it will help us communicate with each other. And I really want to stress the benefits of alignment and transparency. You know, without a precise understanding of the treatment effect that's being described, there's a risk that its magnitude and meaningfulness will be misunderstood. But yeah, hopefully, you know, you feel that we've achieved these learning outcomes for you today. I just want to give a quick promotion in the next slide that we will be looking at some other case studies in different therapeutic areas in our team. So please watch out for webinar 2 coming hopefully in the next few months, which will be in the respiratory area. And now I would like to hand over to Nanco to moderate the Q&A session and invite everybody to please enter your questions in the chat window.
Thank you, Sue. And Melanie, Rikke, and Helle. It has been a really fantastic run-through of what estimands are and what they can do, what they can mean for the results of clinical trials. We have really gotten a number of questions and interesting questions as well, and they're coming in continuously. Maybe I would start with a question on how you would illustrate the difference between intercurrent events and protocol deviations. Are they the same, or can we distinguish between them, and should we do that? Sue, is that something you could answer?
Well, I guess technically a protocol deviation is where you've deviated from what you intended in your study. So not necessarily the same thing exactly as an intercurrent event. I guess the point of an intercurrent event, I would say, is when you're thinking about those, you're thinking generally in clinical practice, first and foremost, you know, what are the things that happen to patients, you know, in the real world, you know, what are the things out there that happen. So and sometimes they can be things that are a bit of a pain, it's true to say, but you know, in a, say, a hospitalized setting of giving infusions to, you know, very ill people, you know, that infusion can be stopped for a number of reasons. The patient might die, the patient might not really be showing any you know, change in their condition, worsening, and you might feel, oh, we need to move them on to something else. Or it could be they've actually got better. You know, so there's different things that could be happening, and we need to be considering those and the impact they have on what we're trying to measure. So we're kind of coming at from it from a different angle, really, and then we're designing our study and what we do to try and you know, deal with those things. But you know, we're trying to pose our questions and understand how these things are framed within our questions. So it is coming from a completely different angle. Mel, I don't know if you'd want to add to that.
I think I was just going to say that in the context of Pioneer 1, if we think about the intercurrent event of rescue medication, of course the study was designed with a placebo control. It had to be that patients were allowed to take rescue medication during the trial, and that was expected. So that's quite different, I think, from a protocol deviation. So I don't know whether Rikke or Helle, they want to also make a comment, but or we can go to another question. Helle.
I have no further comments. I think you summarized it nicely.
Okay, let's move on, because we have quite a number of questions. Maybe also one general question is that could estimates be defined as an evaluation strategy for the study? And could we consider intention to treat and per protocol analysis as some kind of estimands? Is a question.
Maybe I could. So I think that now thinking about the new framework, I think people are thinking about treatment policy as being analogous to the intent to treat principle. And I think what intent to treat was probably always aiming for. I think that the difference now is that probably in the past, people were not thinking about intent to treat in the same way. They were thinking about it meaning that all randomized patients had to be included, not necessarily that all of those patients were followed up until the end of the trial and all data were included. So I think that even though treatment policy, intent to treat, I think now we see them as very much analogous. I think in the past there was a slightly different interpretation. I think per protocol is a tricky one, and I think that now with the Estimand framework, in a way, I mean, for me personally, it's opened my eyes to what we've done in the past. All of us have produced per protocol analyses. It's opened my eyes as to thinking about, well, what does that really mean? It was such a mixed bag, and it meant something different in every trial. So I'm not sure at the moment, and I think it's made us realize that perhaps this concept of per protocol had some flaws, and there are maybe now the Estimand framework gives us a tool to think about other methods that may also help us in the case of, for example, from a non-inferiority trial setting. I don't know whether Helle, you want to comment, or Rikke, of course, anyone.
Maybe I would like just
just one very quick comment on the addendum is not the most complimentary about per protocol analyses, and it really sort of suggests that it's really hard to say what the question is that is answering. So it's kind of suggests there may be a place for per protocol analysis, but it's sort of, I think there's a movement away, and I guess the movement away is more to perhaps to use a set where you use as much data as you can, but you remove data, you remove observations after certain things happen. So after taking a rescue medication, you use that, you know, as we showed in those patient journeys. So it's perhaps leading to a different sort of analysis set where you're excluding just data points rather than the whole subject.
Yeah, and I think also if I see the questions, the estimate is not only on the strategy of handling intercurrent events or how you analyze. It's bringing things together on the population, the treatment, the intercurrent events, and then how you measure your final endpoint that addresses a specific question. So it's not only one element. It's not the analysis strategy only. It's bringing these things together, written together, so it's clear which question this estimate addresses. I think
exactly,
we
yeah.
see that in that way.
But maybe I could add, I also think that the framework as such would kind of ensure that you are consistent all the way through from the objectives towards the end when you have the results, basically. That you have designed your trial appropriately, you have conducted and analyzed your data in accordance with the question you really wanted to ask in your trial. So I think it's a huge strength with this framework that it's actually kind of helping you ensuring consistency across the trial planning, conduct, analysis, and reporting.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question, and that's could be maybe a multiple million-dollar question, which is asked often. But did the choice of these two estimates affect the sample size calculations, and actually which estimate were driving the ultimate sample size?
Well, estimate 1 was the primary estimate. So it was the estimate that was the driver of the sample size calculation. And we tried to kind of try to come up with the expected impact on the effect size and the variation. So it had an impact on the sample size. I don't have the numbers how much it would differ from had we powered it towards estimate 2, but at least it meant something. It had an impact.
So that's often what you hear that implementing an estimate framework is actually driving the sample size up and making trials longer and more expensive. Is that your experience? Or?
No, that's actually not my experience. My experience is maybe there will be a few more patients. I cannot rule that out in general. But what is really good here is that you are actually trying to consider your intercurrent event and how many you expect to have and how it will affect your effect sizes. So you are trying to be more transparent and trying to be more spot on what you or being more precise in your assumptions, you could say. That's a strange way of saying it, but at least again, more structure on your sample size calculation.
Sue and Melanie, can you, from your experience?
Yeah, maybe just on that point, I think it's so important. I mean, if you've agreed your Estimand up front, particularly if you've had those discussions with regulatory authorities and they're on board, then you're very clear about you're clearer about the assumptions that you would use for your sample size calculation and that you've adequately powered your trial. And I think, Nanco, you're sort of alluding to, in this case, if considering Estimand 1, which was more of a treatment policy strategy for intercurrent events, that if that was the Estimand that was of choice, if that was the one that was most relevant and that was discussed with health authorities, then it only makes sense that then that's taken into consideration the sample size calculation appropriately. contrast to that, if you're thinking about a phase 2 study and a different type of decision making, or even in another context, it could be quite a different Estimand, more like our pure Estimand, if you like, where actually then that could be very appropriate for a decision making in that context. And again, that could have implications on your sample size. Actually would mean that you would need a potentially a smaller sample size if you can assume larger treatment differences. So I think it doesn't work in one way. It's just important to get that alignment.
I agree with you, Mel, but the other thing, thinking about that phase 2 situation where you might be primarily interested in sort of proof of concept and the more pure, if only Estimand, but you might well also want to include your sort of treatment policy type Estimand, the Estimand that you think is going to be needed in phase 3. You might want to think ahead to what you're going to need in phase 3, build that in to get some information to help you with your sample size for phase 3. So I think there's implications here in terms of not just, we're thinking ahead in a study, but potentially thinking ahead in a whole program, thinking ahead to that, what we want in phase 3, so we can, we're aware of the Estimands that are going to be of interest later. And also that will help us with our general conduct of the study and managing the data, and potentially pooling data across studies as well, where we might want to think about Estimands as well there. So
yeah, agree. Yeah,
thank you. And I have one question, maybe Rikke, you could answer this. The question is on how the study handled events that precluded future data collection, like death or study withdrawal, loss to follow-up. Are these considered intercurrent events, and if so, how were they handled?
I guess Helle maybe can support me more on these, if these were acknowledged as intercurrent event, not to my knowledge. But I say we have learned a lot from the Pioneer program, and we are moving onwards, and we are identifying also other intercurrent events. We are still evolving, and we are still developing our molecule semaglutide that was investigated in Pioneer 1. And we also truly acknowledge how the patient's journey are different, and also with respect to the prior or the former question with respect to the sample size, how it's affected by different estimates and the different strategies that handle the intercurrent events. We actually have learned that patients on this specific molecule need to dose reduce, and they need to have longer escalation periods. So we are actually adding flexibility also in our new trials, and they of course are being acknowledged as intercurrent events. And just also to the fact that in the Pioneer, with the 2 estimates that we defined, we had the same strategy for the intercurrent events in the respective estimates, but now we're actually working with different strategies for different intercurrent events within the same kind of estimates that we are still working with. So just to say that we are learning and we are addressing intercurrent events in different ways.
Yeah, maybe I can add with respect to loss to follow up. That is not really considered an intercurrent event. That's more like a missing data problem. But with respect to death, we didn't consider that as an intercurrent event because we would not expect to see people die in a standard diabetes trial. Of course, they can die, and we also see that sometimes, but we didn't consider that as being so important that we needed to define it as an intercurrent event.
Okay, thank you. So another question on the study is it correct that, just have to read it, Estimand 1 and 2 in the Pioneer study, is it correct that all patients observed data on HbA1c at week 26 were used in the Estimand 1 and Estimand 2 only uses the data until the first intercurrent event?
Mm-hmm.
That's for Helle.
Yes. Yes, that's correct.
Yes. So yeah, that's correct, and the data in Estimand 2 are then further modeled in the analysis. So then the question, and I think Helle, you already answered that, is what was the primary objective? Type 1 error control, and what was the type 1 error control in the strategy of using these two estimates?
Well, a bit technical, but we said that estimate 1 was the primary estimate. So we actually had some hypotheses that were related to also for another endpoint, where we also used the same, say, type of estimate. So we had a multiplicity controls set up for that part, but we didn't have any multiplicity control for estimate 2, or if you wanted to kind of mix results across estimates. So they should be viewed separately and with no control on the estimate 2.
Yes, it really depends on the question you would like to answer, and within that estimate you control for type error, but not cross estimates. But the question here was, would the study have been considered successful if only one of the estimates would have been statistically significant instead of both? And
yes, it was planned so that it was estimate 1 that was the important one, where we would do claims on. That was how it was set up in the protocol. So estimate 2 was because we wanted to compare to old results, and also because we thought it was a relevant question to include. So yeah.
I mean, generally you'd expect a bigger treatment effect, wouldn't you, in a pure Estimand than in the treatment policy one. So,
but I just think that if it really depends on how your trial specifically is set up, if it's a success or not. So from a regulatory perspective, you should focus on the results from estimate 1, and from those kind of draw your conclusions. Is this a success or not? But of course, you will have more information if you also look at the results from estimate 2. So I think one point to make here is that it's of course very important that you carefully consider what is it that is important here when you plan the trial. What is it that you want to, when is it a success, and then plan it accordingly.
Good, thank you. Then I have a more general question, and from a non-statistician. I think this one is for Sue and your soup analogy. But question is, I guess you need to define how to use the estimates for a specific trial in the submission before database lock. I mean, do you need to pick your story before database lock? Sue.
I mean, the idea is that we're defining the estimands way before that in our protocol. So yeah, that's the idea here, and that's what's quite different, really. I suppose is that quite often things have been left to the statistician quite late on in the process to kind of think, well, how do I deal with this particular thing that's arisen, or so it's yeah, but we're trying to define these really early, and that actually helps. I guess it's the point. I guess the point is some of these questions around, I know Helle mentioned, from the patient perspective, that we might well be wanting to look at what is the benefit in those that are able to tolerate this class of drug. Well, that question, if that's the key question, that leads to a completely different design of study. So, trying to get these questions really precisely sorted out really early is very, very helpful.
Maybe I can also just add that that if we don't have these definitions or define our estimate and decide on what the clinical question of interest is, it will impact all the way down the framework, and it will also impact how the trial conduct is and how our clinical trial operation is how they support our trial conduct. So it has an impact if we. This is just key to set us first.
It was really interesting as well what Helle said about the actual trial conduct, following patients up that bit more. You know, that the retention rate went from being 80% in prior studies to 95% in the Pioneer 1 study, which is, you know, really fantastic. And, you know, presumably there was a lot going on there behind the scenes to try and, you know, achieve that kind of retention rate and reduce the burden on the patients and things like that.
Yes. So we're nearing to the end of our session, unfortunately, but there's still questions left. And I think one question which many people may have is, are there any disadvantages of using estimands? And maybe Melanie, you can start.
No, absolutely not. And I think it's something where yeah, it does take time to get your head around the concepts. I think that when you do and you really start to recognize the benefits, I think a lot of us are thinking a lot about our pivotal phase 3 trials and the regulatory context. But then I think that when you've thought about it, you think this is relevant for all trials. Because it helps us with being very clear about what it is we're estimating, and that has to relate to the decisions that we want to make. So it's worth thinking about it very carefully, and there are so many benefits really. But I don't think anyone else here would say, "Oh, don't do it."
Sue, would you cook your soup without a recipe now?
No, I mean, I completely agree with Mel. Completely agree. I think it just brings benefits. It can take a while to get into that mindset, and I know somebody once pointed out that Estimand is an anagram of a mindset. So, yeah, it's definitely worth persevering with. It takes a while to get everybody on board, sort of talking that language. So it does take time to get your head around it, but once you start to get to engage with it, I think it's really valuable.
Yes, and Helle, also another question here, and the same, the development process of the guideline addendum impacts the development of the protocol stats analysis. Did it take much longer? Did you completely change your discussions?
So if it required more resources to do the statistical analysis, or is that the question?
More on how, no, it was actually how the protocol was developed and also the analysis plan.
I don't think it had a huge impact. And please remember, maybe this is a bad example because this was kind of the first trials where we tried to implement estimates. So of course, being the first, it should take longer time. So to me at least, I'm also biased because I've been working with estimates for quite some time now. So, but I don't think it takes more time, and maybe I can share. I had a really good experience. I was involved in planning a new trial in a new indication, and at that time I didn't know anything about the indication. So imagine this about trying to define an estimate and know all the details on how to analyze. But it actually turned out that it was a great help to me, this estimate framework, because it really helped me to work structured with this, asking the right questions to the right stakeholders at the right time, in the planning stage. So in that respect, you can say you save time because you're not, you're much more structured. So it was a really, really good experience, and also a full cross-functional teamwork again, which is very important to emphasize, I think.
Yes, it is. I'm afraid that our time is up. We had a really good session with lots of questions. There's still questions left, and we will try to do our best to answer all those to the people asking them. I thank you all, Sue, Melanie, for making this presentation, setting the webinar up, and Helle and Rikke for your excellent input and the study example that we can use here to bring this estimates alive. Of course, you can read more on the estimates in the addendum to the ICH E9. The definition is there, and lots of additional information. So do read it, and please implement it in your study protocols when designing a new study. So thank you all for tuning in this webinar, and make the best of it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.